Thanks very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's great to be here. I was here yesterday, and I love coming to conferences where you learn things. So I learned a ton yesterday. And today, we're going to have many interesting presentations from companies that are actually deploying artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I'm sort of the warm-up for that and scene setting. So I'm looking forward to hearing those presentations. So I've been asked to speak on this question of large business, business transformation strategy, and the age of AI, because we can see signs that this new world is emerging. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about that. But I thought I'd first start with the world's 500 largest companies. So here they are, and I'd like to have you imagine how much revenue do you think these 500 companies generate? Just think of a number. How many employees do you think they have? And then what do you think their annual profits are? So the collective revenue for these just 500 companies is $31 trillion. And last year they generated about $1.7 trillion in profits, and they employ 65 million people. And this is just 500 companies. And now you can imagine that underneath these companies, there are many other companies that support them through their supply chains and services and many others. So this is a big target. So I think it's important to imagine what if AI penetrated, because there's just beginning right now to think about what does this mean for these large companies. And it really goes to this question of strategic fit. Companies are constantly having to monitor the external environment and figure out how do they adjust to adapt to that environment. And many companies now are trying to figure out what is the strategic fit they have or don't have with in terms of these new tools, capabilities, and communities that are being built around artificial intelligence and machine learning. But the challenge, of course, is that the future is unclear. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen, and so companies have to make bets. They have to decide, where they're going to go, what capabilities they have, what capabilities do they need in the future. And so thinking about this, and so this is part of what I've been doing for the last number of years, is to kind of map out what is that strategic future look like, and how are ways that we can organize our thinking around this. And so what I'm going to do is kind of walk through a framework for thinking about the future, and then speak a little bit about how AI may fit in that. So here's a framework for understanding change. One is, and this is pretty common, is to think about what the big megatrends are. And they can be demographic changes, it can be a variety of things related to fundamental technology shifts, and even political megatrends that are happening globally. Then you have to think about the shocks and disruptors that can upend these trajectories. You also have to think about the constraints that bind and make some things challenging, right? And systematically thinking about those constraints. And then finally, there are the enablers that allow you to do new things that we weren't able to do in the past. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to walk through examples of each of these. I can't go into depth into a huge number of examples, but let me frame this up a bit. So in terms of megatrends, there are a number of them out there, and I would argue that the rise of the data layer is a megatrend. So over the last century, we've built out a large amount of physical assets, right? In agriculture, with agricultural machinery, and energy with this, networks of electricity grids and pipelines. In healthcare, we see an explosion of all sorts of interesting and important machines that help us deliver healthcare. And then even in banking, there was a surge to retail banking, and so they built these small retail outlets all over the place. But now we're seeing this rise of the data layer. And what's interesting, and I think many of the people in this room are engaged in this effort to figure out how do you take advantage of this data layer, how do we harness this data, analyze it, and then deliver it for productivity and better results. And it happens at different paces and different ways across a whole range of industries. Now, this is interesting, which are startups. So I took this data set, Crunchbase, which you may know, and I just dropped it into Tableau and started playing around with it. And I thought it might be interesting to know how many companies have kind of launched in the last couple of years with data in their name. And I found over 100, and they've been able to raise over $1.4 billion. And I'm sure there are a bunch of others that don't have data in their name, but it just gives you an idea of kind of this trend and what's happening out there, and the tremendous values and opportunities that are taking place with respect to data. My favorite in here is the American Prison Data Systems. If you think about it, there's a lot of data related. We incarcerate quite a number of people in the United States, so there's a ton of activity that you could pursue there. But even large companies as well are beginning to explore new ways of handling their data. So I think it's very, very early days, but there's a lot of discussion now around creating these industrial data lakes, and very interesting about how you actually do that and transform the company. But I think there's a lot of people thinking about this. They don't know exactly how to go about doing it. That fog is very dense. But what we clearly see is a lot of interest in doing this and beginning to see exploration going there. So I think it's pretty clear, but both large companies and small companies are thinking deeply about how to take advantage of the rise of the data layer. So let me walk through some of the shocks that we see. We can have political shocks. We can see actually globally the rise of populism and even nationalism, and I think that that's illustrated through a Brexit and what the vote that just happened in Britain, but in many other countries. We obviously have military, and we just had an incident in Turkey. We have financial shocks. The large one was the global financial crises, but I would even, we have to include China's downturn, which is affecting many resource export countries. From Latin America to Australia and elsewhere. And then we have natural disasters. And what I like to do is talk just a little bit about the natural disaster phenomenon. This is a screenshot I grabbed on Sunday night. So if you're having a bad day and you're thinking your life is bad, just look at this. This is a very interesting. They update this chart regularly. And keep real live feeds on what's going on globally. When you look at it from a global perspective, it gives you a different look at these kinds of events. The trend line isn't very good. Back in 1980, we were having less than 400 major loss events every year. Now the run rate is over 800 a year, so we've doubled the number. And there's a couple of reasons for that. It's not that we're having more earthquakes than the Earth used to have, but the human footprint of physical infrastructure has grown dramatically. When I was born, there were only 4 billion people on the planet. Now there are more than 7 billion people on the planet. And to serve that population, there's just a ton of infrastructure that has been built out. And so these natural events have necessarily or consequently created more loss events. And as a consequence, there's just tremendous attention to this idea of resilience, and not just sustainability, but how do we build resilient, sustainable systems? And so I've been doing a bit of a deep dive on that. But what's interesting is thinking about the applications of AI to supply chains, right? Supply chains you want to optimize them, but you got to deal with these shock events. And so if we can do learning on this, and so companies are beginning to see this, and DHL just came out with an interesting outlook about the future in which they think that this is going to revolutionize how supply chains are managed. And one of the factors that they need to take into account are these types of shock events, and how do you quickly recover from those, maybe even anticipate so that you move your supply chains in ways. So I think this is a really interesting area, and one that has tremendous opportunity for AI to be deployed. Now let me turn to constraints. So these are a common phenomenon that we have to deal with, and I throw out a couple of areas. One are resource constraints. Water is rising globally as a major constraint factor, and companies are trying to figure out how to deal with this. Everything from consumer all the way down to industrial. Another are regulatory constraints. And how that changes, and that can happen in healthcare and in transportation. Many industries face regulatory constraints. And then, of course, we have constraints on talent. There was an interesting article that was written in the Wall Street Journal recently that said that the talent pool for coding and development work in the AI space is highly constrained. So there's intense competition right now for those assets, and that constraint is going to, I think, be here with us for some time. So companies have to think about how to address that and deal with that. Organizational issues can also be constraints. So let me kind of walk through one example of a constraint that I've spent a little bit of time looking at. These are the companies that I've been able to surface that are involved in IoT technology development. So that is Internet of Things technologies. And I've broken them out between small companies and large companies. You have any idea how many small companies are engaged in this space? So by my count, there are over 3,000. And the large companies are about 220 companies. Now what's interesting is that they're all developing products, and so they need to think about what standards do they establish and whether or not they create interoperability with other products developed by other companies. Well, it turns out that most companies want to have their own standard, right? Not somebody else's standard. And so there's this competition going on. And there's a very famous paper that was written a number of years ago called The Art of the Standards Wars. And it talked about why sometimes we see intense competition over standards between companies, and sometimes they get together and actually collaborate and come up with a common set of standards. And one of the quotes that I like from this article is, "Before you go to war, assemble allies." Now what's interesting is who co-authored this paper. Anybody know who Hal Varian is? He's the chief economist for Google now. So you can see that Google understands the standards wars. Now, let's kind of look at this. So if you look at the Internet of Things standards alliance bodies, it turns out there's been this tremendous growth in the number of these groups. I count over 20 now that are involved in some aspect of trying to set standards around Internet of Things technologies. And so what happens, or what's interesting, is when you take these standards bodies and then you break them out by the companies. So each one of these dots is a company, and you can see how they're aligned to different standards groupings. And then also the interrelationship between the large companies and the small companies. You know, most small companies don't set standards. Maybe it happens once in a while on some little thing, but it's really the large companies that set the standards, and they have to think about the jockeying of positions going forward. And so this is kind of the range. And this has raised some concern about how fast will the Internet of Things actually happen if we have this world of fragmented alliances. And so that is a constraint, I think, on the pace of development. And so what's interesting is some companies actually are participating in multiple standards bodies. And so I pulled the top ones out. I think this is the top 10. And so you can see companies like Huawei, Samsung, LG, all interesting because they're Asian companies, are actively involved in many standards bodies. Even Cisco, you can imagine, because they're in the business of connecting various devices, so they're active participants. But even IBM, Intel. But some of the big players that you might expect are not there. Like GE is not on this map. Siemens is not on this map. So thinking about how this space is going to play out is quite interesting. And so if you can think of AI applications here, I think maybe we can change the trajectory. So let me turn now to enablers, right? So I've talked about the megatrends, the shocks, the constraints, but we also have enablers, right, that allow us to do new things that we weren't able to do before. And typically people think of technology immediately, but I would argue that ideas can also be enablers. So if you go back to the challenges that we faced in the Depression in the 1930s, they were kind of stuck in a classical economics mode, and policy was derived from that way of thinking until Keynes came along. And Keynes totally changed the way that economists and policymakers thought about how to stimulate the economy. So I think that thinking about ideas is also an important contributor to thinking about what is an enabling capability. But I'd like to focus on technology, and I'll give a couple examples here. Traffic service positioning system. Anybody know what this does? So basically, this technology replaced the way that we used to connect calls, right? In the, the early days of the telephone, you just had 2 or 3 people, so that was pretty simple. But as this technology grew and more people got phones, you needed to create these banks of switching stations, and many ladies got employed being the operator. In fact, I remember as a kid actually calling once in a while and getting an operator on the phone. Today, it just doesn't happen. That technology has been replaced by these traffic service positioning systems that create automated switches. So this notion that automation is new is, it's not true. We've had automation, and these women actually are not unemployed. There are more women in the workforce than there were at this time, so they found other more interesting things to do. Another is web indexing algorithms. Anybody know what that has replaced? It's actually Yahoo. Yahoo used to do hand-curated. They hired. In fact, there was a fantastic article in the New York Times this past Sunday about the surfers. And these were people employed by Yahoo to do hand curation of web, right? Yahoo shut that down in 2014, but it lasted 20 years, right, this hand curation. But now the algorithms do it much better and more effectively. And the New York Times article was interesting because it kind of walked through what those people are doing today. And one of them is actually making instruments. He does guitars and stuff, and other people are off in media professions. So they've scattered to the winds, but it was a really interesting article to talk about kind of what replaced this hand curation and what those people have been doing. Another area that I think is really exciting right now in terms of an enabling technology are APIs. And I think everybody in this room are very familiar with them. But from a company strategic perspective, it allows you to do a lot of new things more efficiently than you were able to do before. One is to integrate, right, with internally but also externally. To innovate in new ways because you create simpler ways for third parties to connect into and grab your data and your code. Engagement, it creates more efficient ways for you to interact with your customers or your supply chain, lots of different ways. To reach new audiences in an effective way, and also to create new revenue streams. And so I've been doing some research on what does this world look like and which companies have been adopting APIs and which haven't, which has yielded this analysis. So I work with a professor at Georgia Tech who's an expert on network graphing, and we scraped Programmable Web's website, and we're able to collect all of the open APIs. Now there's a bunch of closed APIs, so what this shows is actually a filtered, so this isn't all of them. There are about 15,000 open APIs now, and the ramp rate is just tremendous. I mean, they're just growing phenomenally. But what's very interesting is when you start to dig into this to see, because this is a force-directed algorithm that shows you who's more central to the API economy and who's more peripheral. And you can see some, cast of characters that we know. Google's all over this. Flickr, very interestingly, is in the middle, which to me suggests that images have become very important. And so these APIs that allow companies to organize and share images has become quite important to kind of the way companies do business digitally, and so they're central. But you can also find some other interesting things. So this is the same data, I just got rid of the black. And so when I looked at this chart, I immediately saw an interesting story, which is Amazon's got a ton of open APIs. They have more than 340 of them. And many companies have built new applications on top of those APIs. Now, where do you think Walmart is? Now, Walmart's been making a lot of news about their digital strategy. And so when I saw this data, I was immediately curious, kind of where's Walmart in the API ecosystem or the API economy? It turns out they only have one open API, and nobody's built anything on top of it. Whereas Amazon has a huge number. And in fact, after looking at this, it made me realize it may not make sense any longer to compare Amazon to Walmart, right? Because Amazon is moving away from a pure retail strategy. That's where it sort of started, and most people benchmark Amazon against Walmart. But I think Amazon has a broader vision of becoming what I call an information infrastructure company, right? So it wants to be a foundational player in which many other companies build applications on top of itself. And in fact, it's very interesting to see globally that some companies are realizing this Internet of Things is going to grow and become more impactful globally. And so there is this tremendous opportunity to become sort of the core information infrastructure for that. And we know from history that it wasn't the gold miners in San Francisco that made all the money. It was the companies that supplied the tools, right, or the genes to those industries. And I think the smart companies are realizing, hey, we want to be pinged a lot. Maybe we'll just get a little bit of revenue. But man, there's a huge amount of opportunity there. Okay, so this turn to AI, and we can see signs that this is really growing. So I plugged into a tool that I use that tracks news articles, and this comes from about 10,000 articles that I was able to do a search on, and I typed in AI and business strategy, right? And what you can see is there's been a 6x growth in the numbers of articles that have these two key terms in them from 2013. And back in 2013, you had about 20 or so articles a quarter on this topic. But today, now, it's gone over 150, sometimes almost 200 articles a quarter are written on this topic. And my view is this is going to continue. And it goes back to this issue of companies trying to figure out strategic fit. Right? And they see this new capability emerging, and that is how do they bring it into their company? How do they think about it? What's going on? A lot of curiosity and interest. So that leads us to a couple of important questions. The first one is, how do alert leadership teams take advantage of AI? You know, I think people in this room are schooled in this, they understand it, but that's not true in the executive teams. This is kind of a interesting, shiny new thing, but they don't know exactly how to embrace it, how to deploy it effectively. And so that question is, I think, beginning to move into the decision-making realm of corporate companies. Another is AI similar to other computer technology? So can we take our existing set of capabilities and just plug this in and we're good to go? Or do we have to change things? And I think that is also not entirely clear. You know, and change things mean, do we need new IT systems? Do we need data lakes to do this, for example? Do we need different kinds of people to do it? So lots of questions about the similarities and differences from what's happened in the past. And so I think articulating and making that very crisp and clear is very important for expanding this. Another is what types of internal resources are most needed to be successful in this space. And again, that is a little bit foggy, right? Because we're in the early stages and people are experimenting. And so kind of the checklist, and some consulting firm is going to develop that checklist, but I think it's still early days and we don't know exactly what's on that checklist. The other is what types of business processes are needed. And having worked in a big company and then in my current role, I've spent a lot of time thinking about these things called intangibles, right? So it's very easy to understand the physical assets that a company has, but companies now increasingly in the information age are full of these intangibles, right? So these are these business processes, and one could be compliance systems. So what kind of compliance systems do you need to think about in deploying AI? What kind of data collection? What kind of monitoring do you need to do? And what kind of information flows within the company? Do you need to restructure things? Do you need to create new business units? All that kind of stuff is kind of vague, but it's critical to the deployment of technology like this. And then finally, and I think highly relevant to this meeting, which is what types of external communities and ecosystems can support a competitive advantage for the firm, right? So we see this flowering of activity, and some communities will grow and some will not, right? And we just know from examples, for example, of Facebook versus MySpace. MySpace was much bigger than Facebook, but if you had invested heavily in MySpace, you wouldn't be doing so well right now, right? So companies are reticent and they're searching and they're looking, and so insights into what are going to be the successful communities, and what does it take to create a successful community in the AI space, I think is very important. And the companies, if they can see that, I think they will invest more heavily, and that will help grow those communities. So I think that's an important area to explore. So the last thing I wanted to mention is that this isn't just companies looking at this space. Less than 2 weeks ago, the chairman of the U.S. Council on Economic Advisors was here in New York, and he gave a speech at New York University in which it was focused directly on this topic of artificial intelligence. In fact, if I can read it, the paper, his address was called, "Is This Time Different? The Opportunities and Challenges of Artificial Intelligence." And at the end of his paper, and I put his quote up here, it's quite interesting. He says, "The biggest worry I have about AI is that we will not have enough of it, and that we need to do more to make sure that we can continue to make groundbreaking discoveries that will raise productivity growth, improve the lives of Americans and the people throughout the world." That's really interesting coming from the Council on Economic Advisors, whose job is to kind of set policy and strategy for the future course of the US economy. And as you know, there's this debate that's brewing about whether AI replaces jobs or does it create jobs. And so here they are coming out and signaling that they're worried about the discourse going off on tangents that don't address what we need, which is new productivity growth in the US economy, and the many ways that AI can deliver that. And I think the US is at a very unique place because we've built certain capabilities that have put us at an advantage. And the question is, can we continue to do that? And that requires kind of focus, but also experimentation and a positive environment for companies to invest in this space. So let me just close by recapping and thinking about this framework for thinking about the future, which is looking ahead. You know, what are those big megatrends? Do you have those kind of mapped out in your head? And I mentioned the age of data being one of those megatrends. Recognizing that there are shock events, but a crisis can create an opportunity. So I think thinking about those relationships and how AI can actually be a positive force for thinking about the reality that we're going to be facing these shocks and how do we manage that. And then constraints, and there are lots of constraints out there, but if you're interested in the IoT space, this issue of interoperability between products is a really fundamental one, and so we have to think about how that may make this field go a little bit slower than many people have suggested. And then finally, thinking systematically about the enablers that allow us to do new things that we weren't able to do in the past. And you know, I think we're all here kind of exploring that space, and I think it's really exciting, and we've got an amazing set of speakers coming up. They're going to dig into this more deeply. So with that, I will close. I've got, I think, time for 2 or 3 questions if we want to do that. You can clap. No. Any questions? Yes, sir. I'm supposed to throw this at you. You ready? I'm not a good thrower, so that wasn't too bad.
Just common conceptions of what artificial intelligence is, because I've been in government space and coming out of that, and it's been a real challenge for government managers, and particularly that their skill set is more management and social sciences, that they're really ill-prepared to handle conversations on AI in general. So I was wondering how that you see factoring in.
Well, I think, you know, it's very clear we're in the learning phase of this. And so, again, that's why I go back to this question of communities, because how do you learn? I think you learn in isolation, but you learn better if you're joining a community. So what would be interesting is that we have these communities serve the business community, but we also have communities that serve government, because government has slightly different needs and objectives. And so my prediction would be that those communities will emerge in time, but a question would be, can we speed up that process? Any other questions? No. Okay, very good. Thank you very much.